What's up, YouTube? It's James Q Quick from Learn, Build, Teach. And today I'm really kind of nerding out because I get to play with something fun from my childhood, and that is Pokemon. If you grew up in the 90s, Pokemon was my life for like 10 years, and I still enjoy seeing references to it and playing it occasionally. So anyway, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to work with the Pokemon API, and we're going to build a Pokedex for the original 150 Pokemon with just vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So no React, no libraries, no frameworks, anything like that. Just going to do vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build this really cool Pokedex that shows you all the original 150 Pokemon, have these little animations, and so on. So let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, so I'm starting out on the actual code pen for this. So I'll put the link to the code pen in the description so that you can get to it, or if you could copy this link manually if you want. That's got all the code, so at any time if you need to go back and actually grab the original code, you can go here and grab everything you need. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and start building this together. So what we're going to use to build this is it's a Pokemon API. So that it's called a Poke API. And it took me a little bit to kind of figure out how this API was going to work, how I was going to use it. So I looked at, I tried to just kind of change this to be /Pokemon to see if it would just send me all the Pokemon, and it kind of does. It batches them in batches of 20, but all it really does is tell me the name and then the URL to get the specific information about that Pokemon. So if I wanted Bulbasaur, for example, just do a /1, this will give me all the information about Bulbasaur. So if I started by making a request to /Pokemon, I would need to then make the subsequent request to the Pokemon, which one? In the results here, the Pokemon / and then the ID of that Pokemon. So all in all, what I'm saying is what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through the numbers 1 through 150 and make a request to each one of these URLs. So let's actually start. And what I'm using here is Visual Studio Code, and I've got a folder created called Pokedex. And I want to start with using an extension that I created called Create Web Boilerplate. And what this is going to do when I press Enter on this command is it will generate an indexed HTML, a JavaScript, and a CSS file, and then link the indexed HTML file to both of those files. So let me do this. This should give us our starter files here. I'm going to open up the index HTML. If you start with a blank one, you can do bang and then enter, and it'll create basically this boilerplate as well. And I'm going to change this title to be Quick's Pokedex, and then maybe start off with an H1 in here and call that Quick's Pokedex as well. So if you didn't catch that little shorthand that I'm using, they're called Emmet abbreviations. I will use these throughout the video so you can pause and kind of catch up if you don't get those, but they're little shorthands to generate HTML elements, which are actually pretty handy. So that's what I'm going to use a lot. So we've got our HTML file here. What we need to see, and actually one thing I'm missing is this doesn't link to our CSS file. So I'm going to add a link to the CSS, and it is called app CSS, and then inside of the body, I'm going to add a script with an app JS. All right. So just to make sure that these are working, I'm going to go to app CSS and do a body color red to change the text red, and then in the app JS, do a console log hello world. All right, and then what I want to do is I'm going to open this website up, and I'm going to use an extension called Live Server. So you can install this extension if you want to do it the same way I am. And I'm going to right click on it and come down to Open with Live Server, and that will open up this page on in my browser. So then I come into Inspect, into the Chrome tools, and I just want to see that hello world here is showing up. So because this text is red, because I see that log, I know I've got my index HTML referencing my CSS and my JavaScript file correctly. So let's go back, and we're just going to stub out a little bit of the HTML. Actually, I think that's basically what we want for now. Now let's go ahead and dive into the JavaScript. This is where it gets pretty fun. And we're going to start with just a function to fetch the Pokemon. And this is going to be an ES6 arrow function, so you can check out that syntax. If you're new to that, you might want to look that up. And what we're going to do is define that function and then just call fetch Pokemon. We're going to call that function, and inside of here, we'll just log out fetching Pokemon. All right, so just want to see that that logs out as well. There we go. So now that function is working. And I'm going to get rid of this console log hello world, and then get rid of this console log as well. So inside of here, what we're going to do is use something called the fetch API to fetch information about the Pokemon. So I'm going to grab, here's the URL that I'm grabbing. I'm going to set this here. Oh, it should be a string. I'm going to use ES6 template literal string, something you can look at again if that's new to you. And then just to kind of show you how fetch works, again, this is built into JavaScript. You do a fetch and then you pass in the URL and then do a dot then. So what it returns is a promise. And in that promise, you define your callback. So your callback is going to be an arrow function as well. And after we get that response, fetch kind of has one additional step to after you make the request, you get the response. Then you call the res.json, and that will convert that response to JSON to actually get the body of that response. And inside, and let me format this a little bit. So let's do a dot then down here. We're going to get the response, and then we're going to return res.json. So res.json returns another promise. So then we call dot then again to get our data, and then we can print out the data here. So if you're new to the fetch API, if you're new to promises, I've got a video on promises and the fetch API that you can look at for reference if this is a little bit new to you. So then we just want to log out data here, and I'm going to start by just doing, let's search for Bulbasaur here. So let's save this. Let's come over to the browser, and we should see, here's the information about Bulbasaur. We see his name. That's the thing we care about most. Also, we're going to get type. So this is going to be a little bit tricky because type is actually an array of types. And then inside of each object, you have a type property that has a name for the type, which is actually what we want. It's a little bit tricky to parse through that, but that's what we're going to have to deal with eventually. So let's just look at extracting these pieces of data into an actual Pokemon object. So let's do const Pokemon equals, and we'll start it off by being an object, and then we can set the Pokemon, and then the property name can be data.name. And then let's log this just to see that we're getting that correctly. So let's log out Pokemon and not the data. Actually, we can log out the data too. So let's make sure that we're getting an object with the name of Bulbasaur. That's what we want. We also are going to want the ID. So Pokemon ID is going to be data.id. That's going to be useful. Then we want the image also. So if we look inside of the Bulbasaur object here, it's got a object called sprites. It's got several different sprites. I just want to use the front default. So I'm going to set the image of the Pokemon. So image equals, and then it's going to be result.sprites, and then the property of front default. So that should grab the URL that we're looking for. Let's log this out again, making sure result is not defined. Am I using the wrong thing? Not result, but data here. All right. And over here, we should see ID, image, and name. That's great. Now, the last thing we need is the type. And again, this is a little bit tricky because type is actually an array of types. What we're going to do is just set type to be a comma-separated list of the types of that Pokemon. And so to do that, we need to get each item in the array and grab the name property and then concatenate that with the rest of them separated by commas. So one thing we could do is we could do Pokemon dot type is it types is the original? Yeah, types. And then do a for each, and we could get each type, and we could set Pokemon type equals Pokemon type plus a comma and a space, and then plus the type dot name. All right, so this is going to iterate through each type, and it's going to add it to the existing information that's already in Pokemon.type, and then it's going to add the comma plus the new type name. So save this. Let's see if that looks right. Cannot read property for each of undefined Pokemon.types. Is that not? Let's see if that's right. Pokemon.types is an array. I don't know why that's not. Cannot read property for each of undefined on 13. Let's log out Pokemon.types to see what that looks like, saying undefined. Oh, that's because I'm referencing Pokemon instead of the actual data. Sorry about that. This should be the data.types. So now hopefully we'll see. Looks like that's getting undefined and undefined for the types. So that's not what we're looking for. So what am I doing wrong here? Types. Oh, so it's Pokemon type dot name. Now let's look, and we get undefined, poison, and poison. Not sure why. Oh, probably want to start with Pokemon type equals empty string. So initialize that to empty string, and then see that we have empty string plus poison plus grass. Anyway, so that's one way we could do it, is iterate through each one of these with a for each. Actually want to change this a little bit. We can make this a lot cleaner by doing something like this. If you've ever seen the map function in JavaScript, I've actually got a video on the map function as well. You can do something like this. So you can do data.types.map. And so what we're going to do is get a reference to each type, and then we're going to transform that thing somehow where we want to get the type.type.name. So for each one of the types inside of the types array, we want to grab that name property that we were just looking at. And what map will do is it will do this transformation, and it will return an array where every item has been transformed to the type.type.name. So if we save this, I think this will give us an array now in our Pokemon object. We want this to be a string, so we can do a dot join and say we're going to join these comma separated with a space. So now we should get our string that we're looking for with type of poison and grass. I think that's actually pretty cool. It makes things pretty neat. Now we can take this one step further. Instead of creating the Pokemon here and then going through for each one of the values, we could actually create the Pokemon kind of in line here by doing this and saying name is going to be data.name, ID is going to be data.id, the image is going to be data.sprites, and then front default, and the type is going to be, I'm just going to copy this, the same thing that we just did. So pass it in there. So this will go ahead and basically just initialize that Pokemon object all in line so we don't have to recreate it. Now let's log this again just to make sure that looks right. And we should see again, name, ID, image. Looks like I messed that up. Front underscore default. Let's check one more time. So we got our ID, image, name, and then the type. And that's all the information. If you look at this thing, that's all the information that we need. We got the ID here. We have the name here, the type here, and then the image up there. So that's everything we need. So we've got that information. Now the problem is we're going to have to do this for each one of the Pokemon. So we could do something like this. So for let I equal 0, I less than 1, and actually this is we're gonna start at 1 because we're doing not array-based indexing but Pokemon indexes. So while I is less than equal to 150, and then I plus plus, we could put all of this fetch information inside of this for loop. So let me take all of this inside of this for loop. And what we're going to do is, instead of hard coding 1 here, we're going to use a template variable, and we're going to use the ID, or excuse me, the I variable. And so what this is going to do is it's going to iterate through 1 to 150, and it's going to call the API to get that information for each one of the Pokemon and then log it out. So let's save this, and let's see, we'll see this, it's just kind of scrolling through. It actually happens really fast, but you can see it's going through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 150, and then it gets basically all of our Pokemon. Now the problem with this is really inefficient. So in JavaScript, when you use make asynchronous calls that return a promise, if you use that inside of a for loop, basically this whole thing is going to have to finish before you go on to the next for loop, which is not ideal. Really what you want to use is something called promise.all, which allows you to basically queue all of these things up, and then it'll run them all in parallel instead of sequentially. And in theory, it takes the amount of time it takes to run 150 of these is the same as just one, or it's the same as the longest of the individual 150 instead of 150 times how long they each take, if that makes sense. So what we're going to do is start off by having an array of promises. All right, empty array of promises. Inside of here, what we want to do is we want to get, we want to say promises.push. So we want to push a new promise to that array. And what this will look like, we can shorten this a little bit by using ES6 syntax here to say this is just going to return res.json. And let me get rid of this part because we're going to come back to that. So we're going to push on the promise that is returned from doing the fetch, doing the .then, which then returns the res.json, and this whole thing is going to return a promise that we're adding to our promises array. I know this is probably a lot, but this is going to help optimize how long it takes to get all of these Pokemon. And with that, then we could come into promise.all and take all of our promises. And actually, this should be outside of our for loop. So let's take our for loop and let's move that up here. All right. So then we say promise.all promises.then. And what's going to get returned here is all of the results from all of those promises. So again, let me do this one more time. We start off with an empty array of promises. For each one of our requests, we return that, or we push that promise onto our list of promises. And then promise.all will let all of these individual asynchronous calls run in parallel. And when it gets done, it will trigger a .then, and I get access to an array of all of the results in this results object. So from here, we can come inside and use these results to create our Pokemon. So what we'll do is we could do a results dot for each, and we could iterate through each one of those results and then create the Pokemon. Another simpler way using map is to say const Pokemon equals, and then we can take our results.map, get each result, and what we're going to return is an object for each one of these. And if you implicitly return an object in arrow functions, you have to surround it with parentheses. And so now we can define our object right in line here. Since we've already got what the object looks like, we can paste that in here. And then if I name this to data, now it should work. So I'm going to run through that one more time. That was a lot of JavaScript going on here. So the map function will iterate through an array of some sort of items, and it will create a new array by converting each item in some way. So what this is doing is it's iterating through each result, which is the data coming back from the API call. It's going to get a reference to each one of those. With each one of those, it's going to transform it by converting it to an object in the format that we choose. And the format that we choose is the format that we've already talked about, where we extract the information that we need about that individual Pokemon. And that whole thing, this whole thing, will return an array of those new objects and put them in the Pokemon variable. So let's log out Pokemon here. And let's save this. And now we should see that comes back really fast. So if you remember, in the previous example, you could kind of see those API calls, even though they happen really fast, they were sequential because you could kind of see them scrolling down the screen. Now it's almost instantaneous where you see all of these come back at once. And it basically took as long as one individual call to get all of them. So again, if you need some additional reading in JavaScript promises, got a video on that. If you need arrow functions, got a video on that. The fetch API, I've got a video on that. So do some additional learning if you need to. But this is, I think, some pretty cool JavaScript to go and get all of this Pokemon information. And now the next thing we need to do is we will need to call a function called display Pokemon. And sorry about that. It will take a Pokemon variable, and just want to see that this is going to work. And instead of console logging this, we'll call display Pokemon. So now we still see the same log. So at this point, what we're going to do is in JavaScript, we're going to dynamically generate the HTML that displays all of the Pokemon this way. And then we'll come back and we'll style it, make it prettier and fit this format. But for now, we just want to get this information on the screen. So I'm going to start in the index.html. What we want to do is have an ordered list with an ID of Pokedex. So inside of this Pokedex is where we're going to create all of our LIs, but we're going to do that in JavaScript. So we don't want to start by adding LIs in the HTML. We're going to do that in JavaScript. So let's save that. Let's come back over to the app.js, and I want to get a reference to that ordered list that we just created. So to get that, I'm going to call it Pokedex, and then use document.getElementById, and then tell it I want to get it with the ID of Pokedex. And let's just console log this to make sure we're getting that right. All right. Scroll back over. You should see that HTML element. Good. That's good. So we see that. And now we want to basically we want to generate a string of HTML, and we want to use that to be what goes inside of this ordered list. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to start off with something like this just to show an example. We could do an li, and then close off that li, and then we could say Bulbasaur, and then we'll take our Pokedex, and we'll do enter HTML equals HTML. So this is a string of HTML. It's just hard-coded for now. We can take that string and set it as the inner HTML of Pokedex, and it should get displayed now. So we should see Bulbasaur shows up there, which is cool. All right, but what we really want to do is we want to take each one of these Pokemon, and we want to transform it into something that kind of fits this format. So anytime you think transform, if you're going through an array and you're transforming each object, it's probably going to be, you can think about a map. So let's start with a Pokemon HTML string. And let's take Pokemon and call map. And I'm going to call each one of these individual ones Pokemon. For some reason, growing up, calling them Pokemon was kind of like, it was fun. I don't really know why. So I'm going to call each one of these individual ones Pokemon. And then what I'm going to return for each one of those is a string. So I'm going to come down here, and each one of these will be an li. And inside of the li, we're going to have an image with a source of Pokemon.image. All right. And notice I'm using variable interpolation inside of this string. So because we're using a backticks template literal string, we can have it be multiple lines, which is great. And then we can put quotes inside of it and not have to think about escaping them, and then put variables inside of that as well. So we'll have the image, then we'll have an H2 with the Pokemon or Pokemon ID and Pokemon name. Make sure I'm getting this right. Close out that H2. And then lastly, we'll have just a P tag, and it will display type and then we'll say we want to print out the Pokemon dot type and close out that p tag. All right, let's see what that looks like. And then we want to take this Pokemon HTML string and set that as the inner HTML. Let's see what this looks like. All right, that actually worked pretty good. I think that's all we needed, except one thing we haven't done, and you may have picked up on this, one thing we haven't done is a map returns an array. We actually want to convert this to a string so we can do a dot join again and just do a dot join with no space or anything. And hopefully this will look a little bit more Pokemon type join. Oh, down. This should go right here. Hopefully that's right. All right, so yeah, now we see here's all of our HTML. If we look inside of the Pokedex, each one of these, actually it looks like it's off. It should have been, let's see what we're missing here. It should have been an LI that we didn't close. How did that get converted? I don't know how that happened. This should be an LI. Don't know what went wrong there, but that's what it should be. So let's save that, and now it should be an LI, and we'll look at the HTML just one more time. Pokedex, so it should be a list of LIs, and then inside of that you'll have image, H2, and type. So we've got all of our information here, and it's displayed correctly. Now we just need to go back in and style this thing. So we're getting pretty close. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some classes to these to style them. So these are going to be kind of traditional cards. You can look up HTML or W3 schools cards. Cards are pretty common in HTML and CSS, so it looks something like this. This is kind of what we're going to build, just a very simple card here to display the information. All right, so back in the JS, we're going to generate some classes. So for each one of these, so the image is going to be class equals card image, and then the H2 is going to be card title, and then the paragraph is going to be card subtitle. So these are the typical things that you'll have on a card. Usually you'll have an image. Usually you'll have a title, and then you'll have some sort of like description or subtitle or just some sort of extra text. And so we save this, and let's come to our app CSS. We don't want all the dummy CSS there. So I just want to do a dot card and say background color red, just to see if that's going to show up. All right, so that looks right. It doesn't look very good. And now we'll start to style this a little bit more. So let's start back with the body. And we'll do background color of orange red, I think is one of the Pokemon colors. So we'll do orange red. I'm going to reset my margins to be 0. And I want to bring in a font to kind of style this up a little bit. I'm going to go to Google Fonts, and just kind of show you what it takes to pull in a font here. And I want Rubik. I think I've never used this before. Just kind of pulled it in and do a plus. And we'll see it over here, and now we'll just grab this link here. So grab that link, put it in the HTML, in the head, save that, and then in the body, set the font family to be Rubik. All right, and come back to our app. Now we should see that this has changed a little bit, so that's good. That's what we want. And now let's go back to styling the actual card. So let's start with that. And I want to do the numbers myself. So I want to say list style none, and is that going to get rid of, yeah. So we got rid of those numbers for LIs right there. Want to add some padding to this. Padding 40 pixels, background color. We'll do this just a light gray. So F4, F4, F4. Color of the text, we'll do a 222, which is a dark gray, and save that. And that looks okay. So we don't really see, actually we don't see the background color on the card, do we? So LI card, background color, oh, because this needs that and this. So we'll see how that looks. All right, so you see this weird thing of one, the the card has some margin on the left, or the order list has some margin on the left. So we can actually grab the Pokedex, and we can set the padding, and I had to search for this, padding inline start to be 0. I'll get rid of this padding on the left. So now we've got it full screen. We want to have that background of the orange red, and we want to have them kind of put into a grid. There's a couple things we should add before we do that. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and break these up and use CSS grid to do this. Now, CSS grid is relatively new to me, but I learned this trick from a friend of mine who's really good at CSS. If you're interested in learning more about CSS grid, he's got a course that I can share with you. If you ask in the comments, I'll send you a link. And so what we want to do, let's just look at the final result here, is have them basically kind of set out across the screen. And then the cool thing is, with a few lines of CSS, you can have this kind of wrap and create your cards to wrap based on the screen size, which is really nice. So let's come back. We're going to start by saying our Pokedex. Pokedex is going to have a display of grid. I don't know, this probably won't change much there. And then this is going to seem a little complicated, but we're going to use something called grid template columns. And grid template columns is where we define what the individual columns are for our grid. Now, usually you do something, you say like, all right, we've got 3 columns, or we've got 2 columns, or 4 columns, or something like that. We can do, we can say we want each one of our columns to be 320 pixels at minimum, or 1 FR. Now, 1 FR is a fractional unit, meaning it's going to take up, if you've got 3 things on your row, each one will take up 1/3. So it's basically kind of fractional unit, I guess. If all of them are 1, so 1, 1, 1, they'll each get 1/3. If you have 1, 1, and 2, you'll have 25%, 25%, and then 50%. So it's just a fraction of the total fractional units across the width, I guess, something like that. So we're using min-max here. We're going to say I want it to be at least 320 pixels, and then I want it to be 1 FR at the max. And now this only does 1 column. So what we want to change here is we want to call repeat CSS function, and inside of it we're going to say auto fit, and then pass the second parameter to be the min-max. So what this will do is it will, not repeat, but repeat. That's why it was highlighted weird. What this will do is it will generate as many columns wide as it can based on a minimum of 320 pixels, and then just kind of divide it into evenly across the ones that we have. So let's save this, and we should see now this is getting close to what we want, where we see them laid out in our grid. And if we open this up, we can kind of see that responsiveness. Now, one of the really cool things about grid as well is you can define a grid gap and have that be 20 pixels. And now we've got our gap in here. Now we're looking really close to what we want. We're looking pretty good. Let's go ahead, and I think that's all for the grid. Let's go ahead and style up these things just a little bit. It's not going to take a lot, but we'll go ahead and style those. So we had our card, and then we had card title, and we want it to be text transform. We want this to be uppercase, so the data that we get is not uppercase by default. I don't need a margin bottom, no. Font size, make this a little bit bigger than what it is by default, and then set the font weight to normal. I'm going to unbold that. So now there's our Pokemon font there. And then the card subtitle, usually for like subtitled text, things that are a little bit less important, you can set the font weight to be lighter, and then also the color to be lighter too. So this is going to be 6. Actually, maybe that's not a good idea to do 666, but that's what we got. And then set a margin top to be 5px. This will pull it up, hopefully, and we might need to set the margin bottom here to be 0. So now we're pulling this text up a little bit closer to the actual Pokemon there. So that's it for those two. Then lastly, we can make this card image a tad bit bigger. So let's do card image and set the height to be 180 pixels. And that looks okay, except it's not quite centered. So look at that, it's not quite centered in that box. We can add a margin, little centering trick, margin 0 auto to center that thing. Actually, I do that right? Margin 0 auto on the card image. Is that not right? That's what I've got over here. Let me look through my notes here. Am I missing anything? No. Let me try adding it in here. So margin 0. Did I type it in wrong or something? Still not working. Let me pause and I'll figure that out real quick. All right, so I actually learned something here as I was going back through this. I had originally thought I might make this the individual card itself a grid inside of the grid container. I thought that might be something I would want to do, and I left grid in. And because of that, when I had display grid for the card and then the card image, margin of 0 auto, it did center it. Now the reason is when let's hover on this image. See how it kind of takes up the entire width of this whole thing, and then it adds that margin on either side. When you don't have a display of grid, take that away, you see that the width is just as wide as the actual image itself. So display grid is actually putting everything kind of basically a width of 100% by default. Then margin 0 auto worked, and I didn't even catch that before in my notes. So what instead I'm going to do, I'm going to get rid of the margin 0 auto here and the grid, and I'm just going to take card and do a text align center, and this is going to center all the content. So if I did that right, did I save that? There we go. So now we look, the image is centered, which is mainly what I wanted, and then the text, all the text is centered too. Now I think that still looks pretty good, so I'm definitely okay with that, but it's kind of funny that I got everything centered basically on a fluke and not on purpose. So now I actually learned something along the way, as we all do in this process. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to wrap all of this stuff in a container so that we add some padding and stuff on the outside. So I'm going to do a div with a class of container. Again, I'm using emit syntax. That will generate a div with a class of container. Going to put everything inside of that. And now we need to come to the app CSS and add a container class. Now this will do some padding on either side, so maybe 40 px, and see, make sure I got everything in here. And then this one will use a margin of 0 auto to center everything. So if we look at, we've got our 40 pixels on either side, and maybe we'll make that 20 just to kind of match the grid system here. I don't know if that will, let's see. I kind of like a bigger padding on the outside. I think that works. So now we've got our container, everything centered, has some spacing on the end. It can breathe, which is great. And then the last thing I want to do, I just want to take that H1, the title there, and do a text transform. I want to make that uppercase, and then center it. So text align center, and then do a font size of 54 px. That's just going to bump that thing up here. And then lastly, what I should have done inside of the body was change the color to be white to make sure that this comes out white. So that's almost everything. The only thing left that we have is the animation for the card. So I'm going to come over to the card again, and I'm going to do card again. Do a hover, and then on hover, I'm going to set the animation to bounce 0.5 seconds and be linear. And then we need to generate or create this bounce animation. Did I not type that right? Oh, no space there. And then to create an animation, you use keyframes and then bounce. And then you basically say what it's supposed to do at each percentage or each point along the path of the animation. So we're going to do this just by increments of 20%. So at 20%, I want this to transform, and I want to do a translate Y to be -6 pixels. And what this is going to do is basically just send it up 6 pixels. So if we hover on this now, that may not do anything if we don't finish, transform, translate. I don't know why it's got that extra parentheses there. Should see this just kind of go up and then come back down. And actually that's kind of cool too. But I'm gonna do a little bit of a bounce effect. So I'm gonna do 40% and do a transform. And this one will be same thing, translate Y, but this one will be 0 pixels. So this will go back down to 0. And then at 60%, you want it to go back up just a little bit more. And this will be 2. And then at 80%, you'll come back down to 0. So this is just kind of specifying at each point along the way in the transformation, or excuse me, the animation, do a transform and change its height. And then look at this, and we should have this little bounce effect, which is actually pretty cool. And one last thing I could do is the container. You could put, I think that's further down. Container can have a margin, instead of 0 auto, let's give some, actually, I don't know why it's not doing padding at the, oh, there's the padding. I wouldn't scroll all the way up to the top. So it does already have padding. So this is everything that we wanted to build. I think this is pretty cool. This is a lot of fun for me. I love working with Pokemon. Pokemon was a big part of my childhood, and a big part of just kind of things that I enjoy talking about along the way. We got to use the Pokemon API here. We got to use the fetch API, and we got to use promises, got to use promise.all. In CSS, we got to use CSS grid, which is pretty sweet. I got to use Google Fonts, work with images. Some really cool stuff here. I really had a blast working on this, just kind of playing around and doing some practice on my own. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more of these type of videos. I just want to create, like, real quick, almost like mini applications that are kind of cool, and versus just kind of doing one individual thing. Let's build a little small application and put a couple of different pieces together. So if that's something that you're interested in, or if you have suggestions on types of videos to see in the future, I would love to get your feedback. Please share those in the comments below. Want to know what you think. I'm really excited about this one. I hope you are as well, and I will see you in the next video. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out learnbuildteach.com to sign up for the newsletter to learn about my latest content. Thanks for watching.